How big do you feel now? You know, anytime I get a little puffed up with pride, or I think that my problems are somehow massive, all I have to do is watch this video and remember that I'm just a speck on a speck floating around somewhere in this massive universe, and that the God I worship is the one who's bigger than it all and holds it all together. And it puts everything in perspective. And isn't that what we need sometimes? Our perspective is so limited and so narrow, but it's also pretty much the only thing we see right in front of our face. So sometimes it's hard to remember that the reality of things is so much different than what we usually imagine it to be. It's hard to remember that we see only this teeny tiny bit. Kind of like that part in the video where it's showing you the entire Milky Way galaxy, and then there's that little circle that shows you all the stars you see at night. It's nothing compared to everything that's out there. It's hard to remember that we see only this teeny tiny little bit, but God sees everything. That's what I love about today's gospel lesson. Jesus takes the perspective of his disciples and tries to turn it on its head, at least as much as he is able to, as much as they are able to hear. Because they were sitting there admiring the temple, and this wasn't an unusual occurrence in Israel. To the Jews, Jerusalem was everything. It was their source of national pride, the reminder that they were the chosen ones, the special people of the one true God. By the time Jesus was born, the temple had been the center of Jewish life for almost 1,000 years. And even though the nation had gone into captivity during that time, the very first thing they did when they returned home was rebuild the temple. That was paramount. The temple was the center of Jewish life. In fact, in Jesus' day, it was customary to swear by the temple. And speaking against the temple could be considered blasphemy. The temple was serious business. And it was huge. By the first century, after Herod made some massive renovations to the Temple Mount, the area covered about 36 acres. Now, to try to give you an idea of the ground size that would cover, I did a little search of some of our public records here, and Lakeview Square Mall, with all the surrounding parking lots and all the greenery, everything that's on that big lot there, encompasses 34 acres. Or think of the size of, you know where Floral Lawn Cemetery is out in West Michigan there, headed toward Marshall? That whole land area is about 32 acres. That's how big the temple and all of its surrounding courts were. And it wasn't just big, it was also beautiful. The Jewish historian Josephus recorded that the outer walls and the roof of the temple were covered with gold plates that were so brilliant that when the sun shone on them, it was blinding to look at. And where there was no gold, there were blocks of marble of such a pure white that from a distance, travelers thought there was snow on the Temple Mount. So imagine this massive building and the enormous walls that surrounded it, covered in gold and sparkling white marble. You must have been able to see it for miles and miles around. No wonder the Jews were so proud of this monument to their national heritage. But for many Jews of that day, the temple had undoubtedly become an idol. It had begun to mean more to the people than God himself did. And I'm sure that's why it caused a ruckus when Jesus declared in Matthew 12 that one greater than the temple had arrived among them. And in John 2, when he said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again." Of course, he was speaking about his body when he said that. But no wonder it sounded like utter foolishness to the people who were standing around. Nothing and no one could be greater than their temple. And that's why on this day, I'm sure the disciples once again responded with a mixture of amazement and disbelief when Jesus said, "Yes, look at that great building. The day is coming when not one stone will be left on another." Inconceivable, to quote one of my girls' favorite movies. I'm sure there was no way they could begin to comprehend how something like that could happen. But only some 40 years after Jesus said this, there was a widespread Jewish revolution against the Romans in Palestine. And for a time, it looked like the revolution was going to succeed. The rebels enjoyed many early successes, but ultimately, Rome crushed the rebellion. And when I say crushed, I mean crushed. They utterly destroyed the people, and Jerusalem was leveled, including the temple, just like Jesus said. Historians record that at the fall of Jerusalem, the last surviving Jews in the city fled into the temple because it was the strongest, most secure building in the city. The Roman soldiers surrounded it, and one of them, who apparently was drunk, started a fire that soon engulfed the whole place. And the ornate gold that was on the roof and on the outer walls began to melt in that fire. And it began to run down into the cracks between the stone walls and the foundation of the temple. And, well, you know, it's no good looting a place if you can't take everything that's valuable. So, in order to retrieve all that gold that was running all over the place, the Roman commander ordered that the temple be dismantled, stone by stone, fulfilling Jesus' prophecy that not one stone would be left on another. The destruction was so complete that today there is true difficulty determining exactly where the temple was. If only the Pharisees and chief priests had listened to Jesus and had accepted him as the Messiah. Yes, it would have changed everything. But when we listen to God, even when the changes are hard, they're always for the better. In rejecting Jesus as the Messiah and the vision he brought of the kingdom of God, in rejecting that, the Jews were committing themselves to the tragedy of the destruction of Jerusalem that would take place in 70 AD. You see, I think that's what Jesus meant when he rode into Jerusalem and then wept over the city. You remember he said, "How I wish today that you of all people, Jerusalem, would understand the way to peace. But now it's too late, and peace is hidden from your eyes. Before long, your enemies will build ramparts against your walls and encircle you and close in on you from every side. They will crush you into the ground and your children with you. Your enemies will not leave a single stone in place because you did not recognize it when God visited you." The Jews were so focused on getting out from under the thumb of the Romans that they could not accept anything else. They wouldn't receive a Messiah who talked about turning the other cheek and praying for your enemies. They wouldn't give up their cherished ideas of national independence and supreme dominance of their geographic region. They were determined to fight for freedom at all costs. And most of them did fight to the death. Jerusalem didn't have to be destroyed, but that's the outcome they chose when they decided to walk the path of rebellion. How amazing, though, that God saw it all ahead of time. And he tried to warn them more than once, even though his warnings mostly fell on deaf ears. The disciples, though, were listening as much as they could and asked Jesus to explain more of what he was talking about. And Jesus, as you heard today in the gospel lesson, he described the fearsome times that were soon to come, both for God's people in Jerusalem and also for God's people in the future at the end of the world. It would seem to me that those end times are coming soon. Those birth pangs that the New Testament mentions seem to be increasing The contractions getting closer together and more intense. And as things continue to get more and more chaotic in our world, I have to say, it's very comforting to me to know that we serve a God who sees everything. He doesn't get surprised by any turn of events. He never gets caught off guard. His perspective is massive, encompassing the distance across that entire universe and the distance across the great span of time. We see this much. He sees everything, including the birth of this nation. On this weekend, when we remember how our founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence and went on into a revolution of their own, it's worth noting that John wrote about this great nation centuries before this in the Revelation. He said, "Then I saw another beast come up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like those of a lamb, but he spoke with the voice of a dragon." There we are, America in Bible prophecy. We're the nation, or the beast, that rose up out of the earth, meaning that this country came to be established in a place that had previously been largely unpopulated. Looking like a lamb, meaning appearing to embrace freedom and justice and equality. Those are the lamb's methods of governing in the scriptures. We look like a lamb. We don't speak like a lamb, at least not in the end. Speaking with the words with the voice of a dragon, meaning those innocent lamb-like appearances will ultimately give way to an oppressive power that will use Satan's methods, the dragon's methods of force and coercion. Could that be true? Did God show John in a vision during the first century things that are unfolding before our eyes today? All through the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, God has been declaring things that have come to pass long before they ever came to pass. He knew Jericho was going to fall. He knew Nineveh was going to fall. He knew Babylon was going to fall. And he knew Jerusalem was going to fall. Nothing catches him by surprise. And he's usually warning us about what he knows is coming. But even when he doesn't warn us in advance, I find it reassuring to know with confidence that whatever I'm dealing with today, God saw it all before it arrived at my doorstep. Famous Holocaust survivor Corrie ten Boom once said, "There is no panic in heaven." God has no problems, only plans. I don't know about you, but that gives me great comfort to know that God sees everything. He always knows what's coming. And because he's already seen what's on the way and has a plan to handle it, we can relax and trust him. We may get surprised by life sometimes. Well, I wrote sometimes here, but really, isn't it all the time? Who's not surprised by everything that comes along? We get surprised because of the limitations of our perspective. But whenever we do, let us hold tight to the assurance that our God has everything well in hand. He has no problems, only plans. And since there is never any panic in heaven, there doesn't ever have to be any panic in our hearts either. Amen.